Before the internet told us everything was going to be fine, one movie from the early 90s told us exactly how wrong things were about to go. It wrapped the warning inside car chases, one-liners, and a villain with bleached hair, and somehow nobody took it seriously enough. That was probably the point. Demolition Man arrived in 1993 as what looked like a standard-issue action film. Two tough guys, a frozen future, and enough explosions to keep the popcorn crowd satisfied. But underneath all that noise was something sharper. A film that looked at where culture, corporations, and comfort were heading and decided to laugh about it before anyone else thought it was funny. Decades later, the laughter has gotten a little more nervous. What most audiences never knew was how strange the journey was to get that film on screen. The casting almost went in completely different directions. The sets were borrowed from places that already felt like the future. The humor was smuggled in by a writer who rewrote the entire identity of the project. And some of the technology that looked ridiculous in theaters turned out to be sitting in actual research laboratories at the exact same time. When studios were putting the project together, the original vision for the villain looked nothing like what ended up on screen. The thinking at the time was to pit two major action names against each other, one playing the hero and one playing the threat. The problem was that nobody wanted to be the threat. The actors attached to the project at various stages all had the same concern. A villain loses. A villain gets humiliated. A villain is not the guy audiences cheer for. That kind of role could damage years of carefully built screen persona. So negotiations stalled, fell apart, and the project drifted until a completely different pairing came together almost by accident. What emerged from that accidental pairing was chemistry that a calculated matchup probably never would have produced. The weariness of one performance against the chaos of the other created something that felt genuinely alive, and a little bit dangerous. The actor who ultimately took on the villain role brought something that no script could have fully anticipated. He had trained seriously in martial arts for years, and his physical ability during filming created an unexpected problem for the production crew. The cameras available at the time were not built to capture movement at the speed he was generating. What the crew was watching with their eyes looked spectacular. What they were seeing on playback looked like blur. The solution was to ask someone who was performing at peak ability to deliberately slow down. Even at reduced speed the technique was still exceptional, but the decision revealed something interesting about the gap between what humans can do and what technology can record. The threat the character projected on screen was real. It was just real at a slightly reduced percentage. The female lead also went through a significant change before filming was fully underway. The original casting brought in someone with a reputation for hard edges and rebellious energy, an actress who had recently come off a string of films where toughness was the defining quality. After just a couple of days on set it became clear the interpretation she was bringing to the role and the interpretation the director wanted were pointing in completely opposite directions. The character as written needed a kind of wide-eyed, earnest enthusiasm, someone who genuinely believed in the strange sanitized world around her without a trace of cynicism. The replacement brought exactly that quality, and in doing so turned a supporting role into the emotional core of the film. Her comedic instincts were precise enough to make the satire land without letting it tip into parody. The world those characters inhabited was built on a foundation that most viewers would never recognize, because they had probably driven past it on a vacation. The sterile, too clean cityscape of the film's future was not constructed on a soundstage. It was filmed in the planned communities and corporate business parks of Southern California, locations that already carried an air of engineered perfection. Manicured landscaping, identical facades, streets that felt slightly too quiet for a place where people actually lived. The production found that these real locations required almost no modification to read as dystopian. The unsettling part is that they weren't dystopian. People lived and worked there. They still do. The movie just pointed a camera at the present and called it the future. The vehicles moving through those streets were not props assembled in a workshop. They were actual concept cars on loan from one of the largest automotive manufacturers in the world. Prototypes worth millions, representing real engineering ideas about what transportation might become. The insurance implications alone made every action sequence a logistical negotiation. Stunt coordinators had to design around the protection of vehicles that couldn't be replaced. The irony is that some of the design language from those concept cars eventually influenced production vehicles that real people bought at real dealerships. The movie was driving the future before the future knew it needed a ride. The humor running through all of it was not part of the original blueprint. Early versions of the script were straightforward action material. Corporate future, frozen cop, thawed out to fight a frozen criminal, mission accomplished, credits roll. A writer brought on to develop the material looked at that premise and saw something else entirely. He saw a canvas for cultural commentary, a chance to turn the action genre against itself while also mocking the trends that were reshaping everyday life. The verbal citations for offensive language became a running joke. The corporate takeover of every restaurant became a punchline with real teeth. The cheerful authoritarianism of a society that had traded freedom for safety became the target of almost every scene. The rewrites changed the film's entire identity. What could have been forgettable became something people are still quoting and debating 30 years later. Some of what got added as jokes aged into something closer to prophecy. A throwaway reference to a famous action star eventually becoming a political figure seemed like the most absurd image the writers could conjure. The further the joke moved from anything resembling reality, the funnier it was supposed to be. 10 years after the film came out, the joke became reality. Not all the way, but close enough that audiences who remembered the line felt a very specific kind of discomfort. That is the particular achievement of sharp satire. It names the thing before the thing has a name. Some of the science in the film was not invented for the screen at all. The concept of protective foam deploying during a vehicle collision to cushion passengers had actual research behind it. Engineers were experimenting with rapidly expanding polymer materials for safety applications during roughly the same period the film was in production. The film took a real idea and followed it to a logical extreme, which is a reasonable description of what the best science fiction does. Similarly, the premise of preserving humans in a frozen state was connected to genuine scientific inquiry happening at the time, with researchers exploring how biological processes might be paused and later resumed. The film asked provocative questions about what that technology would mean if it were applied to punishment and justice, questions that nobody had seriously asked in that form before. The underground world existing beneath the polished surface of the film's future was communicated partly through what characters were wearing. The costume design carried meaning that worked on audiences without most of them consciously processing it. The law enforcement uniforms of the sanitized world were deliberately made to look soft, rounded, almost childlike in their color palette. The design choice was a statement about a society that had become so obsessed with eliminating risk that it had regressed into helplessness. The people living outside that system in the underground wore the visual opposite. Clashing colors, worn fabrics, mismatched layers. Their appearance communicated individuality and resistance without a single line of dialogue explaining it. This is design doing its actual job, which is shaping how an audience feels about a character before that character says anything. The man who directed all of this had never directed a feature film before. His background was in avant-garde video art and gallery installation work, environments where the goal was to unsettle and provoke rather than satisfy and release. A major studio handing a significant budget to someone with that resume was a genuine bet, the kind studios rarely make. His outsider perspective explains the film's stranger qualities. The way action sequences feel slightly off from genre convention. The way humor and menace occupy the same frame without canceling each other out. The willingness to let the absurdity breathe when a more conventional director would have pushed toward sincerity. The gamble produced something that influenced how action films thought about themselves through the rest of the decade. The film also existed inside the larger context of its star's career, which was at a critical pressure point. 2 major productions were filmed back-to-back within the same year with almost no recovery time between them. The physical demands of that schedule were significant. The professional stakes were higher. After a difficult stretch in which several projects had underperformed, both films needed to work. Both did. The combination of a survival thriller and a satirical action comedy in the same release window proved something about range that a single project couldn't have demonstrated alone. The timing required to make a comedy land is genuinely different from the timing required to make a physical threat feel real, and both were on display within months of each other. Behind the success, the relationship between the film and the studio that made it had complications that didn't surface publicly until years later. Back-end profit participation agreements are standard in Hollywood contracts, and the accounting practices that govern them have been controversial for as long as the contracts have existed. Films that earn significant revenue can be structured on paper to show losses. Stars who negotiated for a share of profits can find those profits vanishing into a fog of creative bookkeeping. Legal action followed, years after the film had become a cult classic and a reference point for anyone discussing how cinema had anticipated cultural shifts. A settlement was reached without public terms. The film that was about fighting a system that concealed its own operations generated a legal dispute about a system that concealed its own operations. What sits underneath all of these behind-the-scenes details is a film that knew something. It knew that the direction corporate culture was heading would eventually stop being funny. It knew that the impulse to trade freedom for comfort was not a distant hypothetical but a present tendency. It knew that when safety becomes the highest value, everything that makes life interesting gets reclassified as a threat. It delivered all of this inside a format designed to entertain, which meant the ideas reached audiences who would have walked out of anything that asked them to think directly. The three seashells never got an explanation. That was the point. The future is always slightly baffling to whoever gets dropped into it unprepared. The film just made sure we'd still be arguing about the details long after the credits finished rolling.